Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, ESG Reporting Considerations for Governments. Before we get started, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thank you for viewing our webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams, Laurie Tish, Assurance Partner, and Anna Waldren, Assurance Senior Manager. With that, Laurie, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. We are going to give just a pretty brief hit here on ESG. It'll just be 30 minutes long. And I do want to make sure everybody understands there is no CPE being offered with this presentation. So regretfully, if you tuned in solely to get the CPE, this is not the session for you. So with that, let's get started. We are going to go a little basic here just for a couple moments to give you some background on ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And if you used your internet browser and were looking for a definition, you could find dozens of definitions, I'm sure. We picked these just because I think it really is great how it emphasizes value, that it's really about not only having less of an impact on the environment, a negative impact on the environment, but also social governance factors. But all of those things really create value for your organization. And that is important for investors, for your stakeholders, for your employees. And we are going to be spending some time on the business case for ESG and how that pertains to governmental entities. Again, just to give you some examples, and Anna's going to talk in a little bit about very specific examples for many different types of governmental organizations. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone understands when we're talking about environmental, we're not just talking about greenhouse gas emissions, which does seem to be the topic that gets the most attention these days. But it is really everything related to climate, to the environment, raw material sourcing, use of water, use of electricity, the supply chain that you have, and how everybody down that supply chain is using those things. When we talk about social, we're really talking about humans and how we all relate to each other, both within the workplace for your employees, but also your stakeholders and the communities that each of you are serving. Governance is a little bit harder to wrap your head around, but it really talks about the council, the board, the trustees, the executive teams in each of your entities and how you're structured. And as we'll get into a little bit in detail in a minute, really how that leadership views the rest of the E and the S and how things are carried out. So it really does really relate to the leadership of your organization. ESG permeates every part of your organization. It impacts your customers, your stakeholders, your citizens. It's built into your operations if it's done right. There's benefits to this, tax benefits especially for non-governmental entities, but there's actually some available for governmental entities as well. It drives how you're able to attract employees. And increasingly, compliance is important, not only from federal regulations, but we're seeing many, many states come out with climate regulations lately. So one thing that we present a lot, especially to corporations, is just trying to help them see the business case for ESG. Now, Anna and I have both been performing audits and reviews of ESG reports for many years. And if I go back 20 years, it was more about being an industry leader or a way to tell your entity's story. Then as time went on, it became more about, hey, that younger generation is very attracted to entities that have good ESG, sound ESG policies. And so it's a way to attract employees and recruits to your organization. But now, as we're entering kind of a new era for this, it's really becoming more and more about regulatory compliance. We don't have a lot of time to go into it on this kind of quick hit on ESG this morning, but there's certainly a lot of regulations coming into play globally. The SEC has some proposed rules that we're not sure when they'll actually get issued, but they're out there in a proposed state. And many states, particularly California, has recently actually passed and signed into law some very stringent climate regulations. So it's becoming now not just those things about being an industry leader or being a good steward and having that reputation, but now it's becoming forced on entities through regulation and through laws to enact, particularly in the environmental arena, but also social. Now, particularly for governments, let's turn our attention a little bit to the business case for governments. You may be seeing in your own entities where, green bonds are coming into play. Credit rating agencies are looking at more than just financial statements. They're looking at your ESG disclosures. This is a way to attract capital to your organization, to really stand out in your area for being strong with putting emphasis on ESG factors. There's also just that reputational risk, and the scrutiny that governments come under is always so great anyways, and it is starting to become also important in the ESG arena for governmental entities to have that commitment. Again, Anna's going to show in a little bit some factors and key performance indicators that were pulled off of websites that I'm sure you look at your own website and you have something in there on ESG. If this had been 10 years ago, that probably would not have been the case. So we really are entering a new era where it is very important to really show your stakeholders and your citizens that what is your commitment? How are you presenting yourself with respect to environmental and social factors? The other areas, there's a lot of grant money available for entities to improve their carbon emissions, for example. So there's a lot of state and federal money that is available to make those improvements. So when I look at our client base, which so many of you have very large, complex construction projects going on, the fact that you can maybe use some federal or state money to help fund those, if you're able to also insert some savings, efficiencies that are required even by law these days, it's just very helpful to know that you don't have to always pay for that all by yourself. There is federal money out there for you. So let's turn now to what would you need to do to start, or if you've already started, how would you continue to implement and update that successful ESG strategy? And there's really a lot of components. We like to really look at it as, first, you have to make sure you've got all your ducks in a row. You're ready, that you've got you've got internal controls, you've got data, you've got an ability to know what you have to pull it together. So there's a lot that goes into that first box of readiness. And I'll hold that thought. We'll cover that in just a little bit. Governance is also very important. If you don't have your senior leadership team and your board or your council on board and really driving this down through the entire organization, it probably won't be very successful. It's something that really has to be done by all departments. Everybody needs to understand what the goal is, and there needs to be that very high level, broad support from the executive team. Data is key. And I'm sure by the end of this presentation, if you didn't know already, the ESG data has that same level of importance as financial data, and oftentimes they're intertwined, and we are going to talk a bit about that as well. And then I'll turn it over to Anna, and she'll talk a lot more about the reporting and the communicating out of this whole stage of implementing and updating or maintaining your ESG strategy. So again, just readiness is important, and I don't have time to really go into detail with a lot of this information on this slide. There's a lot on here, but if you really do need to incorporate your ESG strategy into your risk profile. So if your risk assessment that you do as an organization, many of you probably have a risk, a department that handles the risk, or an individual, or your internal auditor. Somebody is really managing or owning the risk to your organization. And ESG should fit right into that, where you look at, well, what are our climate risks? What are potentially reputational or financial risks if we don't have an ESG strategy? Resources and capacity, again, as I mentioned, collaboration and communication amongst all of your employee groups and your departments is very important. Leadership, there must be some influential individuals in that senior leadership team that make sure the message gets out, that everybody understands what the ESG strategy is, because it can get very complicated and very complex fast. And then just alignment. What is it that you need to communicate to your stakeholders? And you know, who is your audience? Because you have a lot of them. You have ratepayers, you have citizens, you have many different types of stakeholders. If you have bonds, you have the bondholders. So there's just a lot of different individuals that might need different messaging. I mentioned earlier that it really cross-functional approach is very important. So that relates to, you know, all of your operational departments. And don't forget about internal services, because that S in ESG, the social, that's a lot of times where you're going to turn that lens inward, and you're going to look at your employees, and you're going to look at many of the different factors that come into how you're treating your employees. What is the role of HR? What about your internal admin services that exist to serve the organization itself, as opposed to that outward focus? So it's very important to really think about ESG in those terms. It's both inward to those departments, but also outward towards all of your various stakeholders. And of course, none of it can happen without that leadership and board support. And again, this is a little bit of a repetition, but I like to just, you know, many of you are general governmental entities that perhaps have a county or a city council. And that's, you know, elected officials. So you can't forget, how do you brief them? How do they come on board where they're supportive and they fully understand what the ESG strategy is, especially if they're in office for 2 years or 4 years and they don't have that buildup that a senior executive or even any employee within the organization may have. So again, just how that communication gets communicated and how that leadership spans across many different types of leaders in your organization. It's a little tougher in governmental organizations to get that buy-in than it would be, say, for a corporation. And this is a slide that you might want to use to just assess your own governance. How effective is your board or council or your senior leadership team with respect to ESG? Where are the decisions being made? Are they being delegated to a senior management personnel, or is it being done at the governance level? And there's pros and cons to both. There's nothing that's right or wrong, but there's just a lot of factors to consider about how you're going to not only run the operations of your ESG, the data, but also as Anna's going to get into, how that's pulled into a report and how that's communicated. Now, I've been talking around this a little bit, but it's so important to have good data. You have to have internal controls around your data. You have to understand what data is that you're trying to pull. Maybe work backwards. What is it that you want your report to say? What are the key performance indicators that you want to focus on? Because there's thousands. So you do have to narrow it down. You can't report on every single thing. So what's important to your stakeholders? What's important to your organization, and decide what is the data that we need to pull to be able to focus on our report. And it's always great if you have existing reporting processes that would tie into your general ledger, or that would tie into your existing internal controls and reports, and then have that data be streamlined with other data such as financial data. Is it verifiable? Is it reportable? Those are very important. So again, I'll just end with data management, strong data environment. That is just number one, very, very important. You can't really go forward without this. So with that, Anna, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about just telling your story and the report and the communication aspects of ESG.
Thanks, Laurie. So continuing kind of on that continuum of your ESG strategy, once you've outlined what that strategy is and you've started to implement it, generally the next step is going to be working on reporting what you're doing out to your stakeholders. I personally think that this is one of the most exciting parts of ESG, is getting to tell your story about what all you're doing and what that actually means for your stakeholders. So when we talk about telling your ESG story, we're talking about some of the decisions you're making regarding what KPIs you're going to report, where you're going to be reporting that information, what form will that information take, and who are you ultimately trying to reach. We call it telling your story rather than just reporting, because this is really your chance to connect with a certain audience or audiences. And in financial reporting, you generally aren't afforded a high degree of flexibility in order to adapt the information depending on who it is you're trying to reach. But with ESG reporting, there really is some built-in flexibility there. And so in order to connect with your intended audience, we do recommend that you're tailoring your reporting based on your stakeholders, that you're being clear and identifying all that you've done that differentiates you from your competitors or other entities you compare yourself to. And then the ways that you're demonstrating that your entity is being authentic to and living its values. And I'll say generally, when we're talking financial reporting, we don't encourage people to tell stories, but this is really a great place for you to add some color to the metrics that you're putting out to your audience. We also want to highlight this is really your chance to tell your story, and that may change over time, and it's okay to have goals that change and have a focus that shifts as the life of your ESG reporting goes on. That's very exciting and a dynamic part of this ESG reporting, but we do always want to encourage that you're transparent about what's changed and why. So how you get ESG information out to your entity's stakeholders is also going to be a part of that strategy decision. This information can take a lot of shapes. It could be something like an integrated report that's integrated with your actual financial information. It might be a separate ESG or sustainability report that you're publishing. Could be just certain KPIs that you're putting on your website, or maybe you're submitting your greenhouse gas emissions to the CDP. Can also take other forms, things like how you design your code of conduct, supply chain reporting, any claims that you're putting on your website, or advertising if your agency does some advertisements. But really, regardless of the form, it's really important that you're including that necessary context with the information, as that's really how you get to shape your entity's story and make sure that viewers aren't drawing their own conclusions from the information that you're putting out. when we talk about ESG reporting, there are some challenges that we do just want to call out. Lots of entities run into these, and when not handled appropriately, this is what can give ESG reporting a bad name. The first challenge is really that oftentimes ESG reporting is separated from financial reporting, and it may not line up between those two reports. And really, a lack of consistency is going to be the easiest way to lose the trust of your stakeholders in the claims that you're making. The second challenge is that there isn't just one set of standards for reporting. And this has a couple of challenges. One, it makes it very hard for your entity to know maybe which framework it wants to follow when you're setting up your reporting. It can also make it really challenging for your stakeholders to try and compare reports and entities if that reporting isn't apples to apples. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those frameworks that are available and the thought process to go through when you're picking out which framework you're going to use for reporting. Another challenge that we see is our human tendency to focus on positive outcomes, and that often can creep into our ESG reporting as well. So there's a risk where each year maybe an organization is only reporting its successes for the year and isn't transparent about goals that they didn't achieve or areas where they may have taken a step backwards. And then also because there is still a lack of regulation, I think it's getting better. Even when we look back 10 years when I started doing this and even further for Laurie, there's more regulation, but there is still a lack of mandatory regulation in this space, and that creates a heightened risk of greenwashing. We've all probably encountered some examples of this, but that's essentially when a brand or organization is relying on marketing techniques to persuade you into believing they're doing green work. So when you have your data and you've been measuring and tracking and you're ready to tell your story to the stakeholders, how do you actually go about starting to report? And I think this graphic is very helpful for just outlining some of the most critical elements of your reporting that you need to be working through before you're putting out your ESG information. And I'm just going to briefly touch on each of these items. So I mentioned previously, there isn't just one framework or set of standards that's available for this type of reporting. In actuality, there's really a wide range for you to choose from. And when you're deciding which framework your entity is going to use or multiple frameworks, we recommend that you think through what are the key performance indicators that are important for your organization, your investors, your customers, your constituents. This can really guide which framework is going to best mesh with those goals. It's also not a requirement to use a third-party framework. You are able to develop your own criteria for how you want to measure and track success in the ESG space. However, I will say we are seeing increasingly stakeholders expecting organizations to report within existing frameworks as people are getting more familiar and more exposed to what's out there. We did put together this slide just so you have some of the more popular frameworks all in one spot with just a little bit of information on what each does. So the CDP, GRI, SASB, TCFD, and ISSB are all very big names in the ESG space and all have widely recognized frameworks. You'll notice as you read through the table, there's a lot of overlap and collaboration between these entities. In fact, the ISSB has assumed responsibility for the SASB and is also going to start overseeing the TCFD framework in 2024. And without getting too in the weeds here, I did just want to highlight some information on the CDP and the ISSB. So the CDP, this was formerly called the Carbon Disclosure Project. It now goes just by CDP. It is the largest global repository for greenhouse gas emissions. And the CDP works in a way where you essentially work through its questionnaire and disclosure questions for your submissions. So it's a very guided process, which can be helpful if you're just getting started on your reporting journey. The CDP also highlights that they work with governmental agencies to give comprehensive feedback on your local government's climate action efforts. So an added benefit of working with the CDP there. And then the ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, they've been extremely active in the space lately, either taking over or closely collaborating with all of the other entities that are on the screen. And the ISSB in June of this year did release the first set of global standards, which included general requirements for sustainability-related disclosures and climate-related disclosures. This is pretty exciting for us who's been in the space for a while. This is the closest we've gotten to a global universal standard. And while there currently aren't regulations that are requiring reporting under these standards, there is an expectation that governing bodies will start adopting the standards in the near term. And then outside of choosing your framework, another important part of getting your ESG reporting underway is making sure that you have clear goals and outcomes that are defined for your organization, as these are ultimately going to be what you're reporting on. We'd recommend you develop both long and short-term goals and outcomes, and then for each of those outcomes, you're developing meaningful key performance indicators to track that. Some questions to think through would just be, have you developed an ESG mission statement? How is that fitting in with your strategic plan, mission, and values? And then how are these goals going to be met and measured, and who in the organization is responsible for the goal? So this is what Laurie mentioned previously. Just to get the creative juices flowing for you, we did put together some trends of goals and KPIs that we specifically see in governmental entities' websites, ESG reports, also what investors in this space and stakeholders are saying they're looking for reporting on. And we've broken it out by entity type, but I'd say there's a lot of crossover between the different columns. You may find that, you can pick some of these items across the different entities. And I just wanted to call out a few big ones that I think will impact a lot of different types of governmental organizations. One would be the electric vehicle strategy. That's definitely picking up steam that I'm seeing with our clients, as well as in the California state, just an emphasis there on electric vehicles. Also goals around minority business participation in your agency's procurement process. I think that's a really big one. I think a lot of clients we work with have a very big procurement group, and that's a lot of what they do. And so you probably already have some policies in place there that you're able to take credit for. And then I think greenhouse gas emissions reporting is a big one for stakeholders across all types of organizations, as well as I think constituents are used to hearing a lot about wildlife and watershed protection, and that's something they're looking for. And then pivoting more on the S, any work you're doing over anti-racism, different trainings and workshops, that's all things that you can definitely highlight and take credit for. And then for airports, who I spend a lot of my time auditing and working with, what I see commonly and that I think is important to highlight are things like noise mitigation efforts, disposals of fluids from aircrafts. I'm having a lot of conversations with clients now about what they're doing around the use of PFAS. And then for seaports, any clean air programs or work that's being done over habitat or natural restorations. And definitely feel free to download these slides and have this list of different KPIs as you're thinking through your own strategy and what you want to highlight. These are a couple of good examples. And then just wanted to highlight, part of telling your story is making that connection with your stakeholders. So make sure you're making it relevant and applicable to them. And then don't forget that you should be establishing internal controls along with your ESG reporting cycle. The same principles that you apply to financial internal controls apply here: completeness and accuracy over data, appropriate levels of review. And then just another highlight to keep it consistent, both with your organization's mission and values and also with other reporting, as well as year over year, tracking your goals. Consistency is key to building that trust with your stakeholders. And I'll hand it back to you, Laurie.
Thanks, Anna. I didn't want to interrupt you, but my favorite slide of everything is the internal control one, because I just, Anna, you know, you and I have worked on numerous ESG examinations and reviews, and you know, you just can't audit something if there isn't a good internal control structure. So if you get nothing else out of this presentation today, internal controls are super important when it comes to ESG, just as they are with your financial statements. So I'm just going to wrap it up now with a couple slides on how Moss Adams can assist you. We have been doing examinations, which are audits, similar to an audit, and reviews of ESG information going back 20 years now. And of course, more recently, we spend a lot more of our time helping our clients with developing an ESG strategy. We also have a great tax department that is very well versed in tax benefits, mainly for corporations, but there are certainly opportunities for some governmental entities as well with respect to certain things they can get refunds or rebates on, even though you don't pay income tax. Data analytics, ESG software solutions, we can certainly assist with your supply chains, and just your readiness to start reporting on ESG information if you have not been doing that in the past. So don't hesitate to reach out if there's something we can assist you with. This slide is up to date. I checked all the web links myself. We have to do that every time we make a presentation because they seem to change quite rapidly with all of some of the mergers and the takeovers of different ESG organizations. But these are all up to date, and I thought this was a good resource list for each of you to take a look at. And also just want to remind you that we do have a lot of CPE opportunities. We have a mailing list. We're happy to add you to that if you're not already getting our alerts or getting our invitations to our CPE webcasts. You can also go back and look at some of the previous ones that we've presented, as well as our articles and alerts. So please don't hesitate to reach out to Anna or I if you have questions on anything that we went over, or if there's anything that we can help you with. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Laurie, and thank you, Anna, for a great presentation today. As you both mentioned, you can download slides for today's presentation in our slide deck and handouts widget. We'll also be sending them via email after the webcast. If you submitted a question today, we'll be following up with you via email after the webcast as well. And again, you can reach out directly to Anna or Laurie with more questions. And here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.